today we have a very interesting person with us, personally very interesting, and I'm sure you will find it too, Professor Gary Urton. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you.
It's so good to have you with us. Professor Urton is a professor at Harvard University of Pre-Columbian Studies, and he used to be professor of anthropology at Colgate University, and it was just so good to have you. Now, you studied the Inca Empire, right?
Right.
And we want to know a little about it. So when I hear about the Incas, when I hear about Peru, South America, what's the first thing that comes into my mind? Machu Picchu. Right?
Right. Right.
And a great place, but there's a lot more to it than Machu Picchu. Tell us about the Incas. Who were they? How big did they get?
The Incas were, they were technically a family, a lineage, that was at the core of what was actually the largest empire, the largest state in the pre-Columbian New World. So when we use the term pre-Columbian, we're talking about the Americas before the time of Columbus.
Right.
And so their empire was centered, the capital of the Inca Empire was in the city of Cusco, which is in present-day Peru. The Inca Empire spread some 3,000 miles along the western coast of South America from the present-day border between Ecuador and Colombia, all down through modern-day Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, northwest Argentina, and down about halfway into Chile. So it was an area, a vast area, stretching along the western side of South America.
Incredibly vast. And what period of time are we talking to? So the Peru was conquered by the Spanish in 1532. How long did they rule before that time?
Actually, a very brief period of time.
Yeah.
The Incas didn't exist as a united, as a coherent entity for more than probably 125 years, maybe max, if you're generous, 150 years or so.
Very short time.
Right.
Yeah.
But they were the end of a sequence of culture, of evolution of cultures, beginning some 3,000 to 4,000 years BC. Early civilizations on the coast of Peru and up in the highlands, and then linked as well to people and resources in the tropical forest of the Amazon basin. So they were just the end point of this, and they consolidated several early states that existed before them. They brought them, they conquered them, they allied with them, they brought them all together.
Yeah. So how in 150 years or 120 years did the Incas conquer all this? They must have been tremendously organized.
That's, you would have to say, the $64,000 question that archaeology is trying to answer and has addressed for more than a century or so. But we think that, I mean, the Incas did not begin with a clean slate. I mean, they were heirs to the development of cultures for a very long period of time. And immediately before the Incas, in fact, there were two other pre-Inca states. One sort of to the north of where the city of Cusco. That was an old empire called Wari, and then to the south of Cusco there was an old empire down into Bolivia and Chile. It was called Tiwanaku, and the Incas consolidated those territories, and they took advantage then of what had been developed by those cultures. The road system of the Incas was founded on earlier road systems. Their systems of government, their forms of labor organization, we're pretty sure that much of that came down to them from earlier sources. So, but what they did was that they, in 125 to 150 years or so, they put their stamp on their version of this thing, and they brought a cohesiveness and a coherence to the political system, and it was all really under the aegis of the Inca himself. The Inca king was considered to be divine.
I see.
And so it was the person of the Inca that was the focus of this unity of this great territory.
So I have a controversial question. what was the population of the Incas at its height?
It is a controversial question, and there's been a barrel or two of ink spilled on that topic. The best estimates that I've read are somewhere between probably 9 to 10 million people or so, again, over that area of about 3,000 miles. Very rich territory. The coast of Peru is adjacent to the richest fishery waters in the world. Extremely productive soils up in the highlands and down in the tropical forests. So they could sustain large populations, and as far as we know, they did sustain large populations. So that's, of course, much less than the number of people who occupy that territory today by several factors, but I mean there were at least 9 or 10 million people. So they brought people together from all those different ecological zones that you just described: the dry coastal desert, the mountains, and the tropical forests.
And they built roads, as you said, all those mountains. That's incredible feat. They were like the Roman Empire of the New World.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and an extremely complex road system, which today is recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Monument.
Yes.
The sort of collectivity of segments of road that still exist. There were 2 main routes of that road. One ran along the coast, one ran through the Central Highlands, and then they were joined to each other by trunk roads at various places. So they had a very efficient system of transportation. The important thing to recognize is that they had only the llama and alpaca as draft animals. And they had no wheeled vehicles.
They had no wheel.
They did not invent the wheel.
Yes.
Right. And if you, having ridden your bicycle over what are the fairly good roads of the coast and the highlands, you can see that without asphalt, that would have been a very rough terrain that you would have been riding over.
Okay, Gary, it was a long time ago, and fairly good is not the word that I would have used at that time, although things have changed so much. Now, we know that before the Spanish came to the Inca Empire, their disease came before them, didn't it?
That's right.
They were, and their artifacts and things came before them. So the Incas were in a pretty sore state when in 1532 the actual Spanish arrived. Isn't that right?
Right. They were already being weakened. I mean, the what we recognize as the 11th Inca king, a man named Huayna Capac, died, we think, according to colonial sources, only some 5 years or so before the arrival of Francisco Pizarro in 1532. And we think he died actually perhaps of measles or of an epidemic. But the diseases of the Spaniards entered the continent of South America and moved through the continent before the Spaniards themselves actually arrived in many places on the continent.
So it's estimated that 75 to 90% of the native population were killed by diseases and war.
That's right. In some of the accounts that we have, where we have fairly good demographic records, it's clear that over a period of probably the first 50 years or so, 50 to 75 years after the conquest, that the population level fell by up to 90% or so. So massive die-off of the population. Some of it was due to wars and conflict, but the vast majority of the deaths were due to diseases.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that the Incas were as good in science and mathematics as the Europeans were, and that they were as advanced in metallurgy and irrigation and road building as Spain. Is that fair?
I would make that argument, right? I think certainly. I mean, it's an interesting point about metallurgy, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I mean, we know that, for instance, their understanding of celestial motions was extremely complex. So if you take the time before Copernicus and before the use of telescopes in the early European astronomy, early Renaissance European astronomy, that what the Incas, the ways, their understanding of the motions of celestial bodies was as sophisticated and as systematic as anything we read really in those early Renaissance and late medieval accounts of the heavens. In terms of and their mathematics was very complex as well. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Kifoos.
Yes.
But in terms of metallurgy, I mean, we know that they were extraordinarily skilled metallurgists working with various alloys, a tremendous range of alloys. The problem with the metallurgy, you could say the historical problem with the metallurgy, is they were expert at making brilliant
gold.
Ornaments. But it turned out that the conquest was not about brilliance and beauty, but it was about the strength of weapons, right?
Yeah,
what could pierce and what could cut most effectively. And that was not the focus of their metallurgical tradition.
No, I've seen some of the artists before Columbus came, before pre-Columbian, and just beautiful work, you know, outstanding. And we kind of think that this was 100 years before Galileo. So we think that the Europeans were so much advanced, and yet the native people, which when I grew up in schools that taught us that these were savages.
Right.
No, either noble savages or savage savages.
Most of us do grow up with such ideas or presented with such ideas, and it's really based on a lack of understanding of the complexity of their bodies of knowledge, their systems of knowledge from before the time of the conquest, and then comparing what we sort of came to understand about their civilization as it was in decline and comparing it to later European civilization, like Middle Renaissance era, you know, post-telescope, etc.
This is so fascinating, and I want to get to the subject that at hand here, but I just got to ask a couple of more questions. The Incas were concerned about the well-being of their people. Would you say that's true, and how do you know that? Did they treat people better than, say, the Roman Empire treated its people? Or
it's hard to make that comparison. I would say, just in the case of the Incas, that the Inca was known as a benign individual who oversaw and who was responsible for the welfare of the people below him. So all of the officials in the Inca Empire who oversaw the various districts. The empire was divided into some 80 provinces, each one of which had over it an overseer who served at the behest of the Inca and who oversaw that province and making sure that the population was fed adequately, and if there was famine, making sure they took from the public storehouses and gave food to the local people. One thing that's important to recognize is that all land in the Inca Empire was divided into 3 parts. One part belonged to the Inca or the state, one part belonged to the gods, and one part belonged to the people. And so we can talk about what they were doing with the state land and the gods' land, right? But locally, 1/3 of the land belonged to the people, and so that was under the control of local communities. People had usufruct rights, use rights on it. They didn't have private property, but they had use rights over it. Each individual belonged to a clan, and clan had rights over land, etc. So, and the Inca supported that kind of distribution of wealth, but then the Inca drew from it as well, because the Inca drew on the strength and on the bodies of his subjects. the system of tribute in the Inca Empire was a labor tax.
Yeah.
So people in the empire didn't owe the Inca anything from their storehouses, but what they did owe was they owed labor time.
Right.
So they had to spend so many days every month working on state projects.
Yeah.
And so they saw to the welfare of the Inca, and the Inca had to be sure that they were cared for, or else they wouldn't be there to devote their labor to his interests.
Okay, let's get to the Khipus now. This is what you study. So tell us, what is a Khipu? We're going to show a couple here.
Right.
What are they made out of? Tell us.
A Khipu is a knotted string device. It looks a lot like a knotted mop.
Yeah.
So they're built on the framework of a fairly thick cord. It's about as thick usually as your little finger or so. And there are multiple strings that suspend from that cord called the main cord. And we have some Khipus that have as few as 2 or 3 of these pendant cords hanging from the main cord, up to as many as 1,500 pendant cords hanging from the main cord. So they come in all sizes. The average size from our studies of them is about 85 to 90 cords or so. So, but then they were colorful generally. They were made either of cotton or of camelid fiber, so the fiber of llama and alpaca. In some cases, they are dyed a beautiful array of colors, so they can be quite beautiful in terms of color. But if they weren't dyed, then they had their threads were usually of quite varied colors as well, but the whites and browns and yellows of cotton, because they grew cotton in some 6 different colors in the Andes before the conquest. And then when they made the cords out of the fiber or the hair of llamas or alpacas, they could be blacks and browns and grays, etc. So they're quite colorful. But then they knotted them in these pendant strings in a complicated way.
Yes, different types of knots and all.
Right.
They're very beautiful. I've seen them, and it's incredible that they've survived all this time. You've studied about 932 or
something like that, right?
Yeah.
We have inventoried now over the past 25 years I've been working on this project. We've inventoried about 1,040 or 50 or so.
Yes.
And they exist in museums primarily in Europe and North America and in Peru and Chile.
Yes.
The largest collection actually is in the Museum for Volkerkunde in Berlin.
In Berlin.
The Germans became very interested in the Khipus from early on, probably because of their links with mathematics and science. And so about 450 or so of the Khipus are in the collection in Berlin.
Yeah.
We've studied those over the years, right, as well as others in other collections.
I've tracked down one in a private collection, and it's in Portland, Maine, and I'm going to give it to you. Going to find a way to get it to you to study that one as well.
Great.
So, and now, what do these Khipus tell us? We have. I grew up thinking that the Mayas and the Aztecs were the only people that had written language. A lot of the books of the Maya, by the way, were destroyed by a Catholic priest. But now these seem to have some kind of a language or some kind of accounting. What do they tell us?
Well, to answer that question, it's easiest, it's most straightforward to begin by explaining what we understand about what was actually being recorded on them. And primarily what was being recorded were numbers. So when I say that they knotted these cords, they knotted them not just randomly, but in general, they knotted these pendant cords in different tiers or different levels. so that they would put knots near the bottom of the string and then leave a space, and then another group of knots and a space and another group of knots. And those were in a place value system, in a decimal place value system. So with the ones at the bottom, the tens, the hundreds, the thousands, and so on.
Yeah.
They're ones that I've studied that go up to the hundreds of thousands, but theoretically you could go into the millions. But so they were recording numbers, and we think they were recording numbers for administrative purposes.
Right.
They were recording censuses, they were recording tribute, they were recording resources that were stored in state storehouses. Just to go back to the tribute, recording tribute, remember that means that they were recording man hours of work.
Oh, as
so
opposed to
that's recording time primarily.
I see.
How many days of work are required of this group or that group? So they're the numbers, but then any time one has a number, in order to understand the significance of that number, it has to be seen in some context. So the pendant chords on a quipu were usually organized in different groups, by different strategies, by different groupings of strings, by different strategies. So you could have like 10 pendant chords and a space, another 10 and a space, another 10 and a space. Or you could also have a strategy of different colors. So you could have chords organized like 5 red chords and 5 green chords and 5 white chords. Using color and using spacing as various strategies to set apart or to group the information into different categories. So part of what we're doing, when I came to Harvard 18 years ago, I started a database project, the Quipu Database Project, with the support of the National Science Foundation. And we've since recorded information on about 800 or so of the Quipus, and that records, that includes information on measurements of all physical features of the Quipus, like how far it is from the last knot on this group of knots to the first knot on the next group of knots. And so trying to describe these objects in such a way that one could produce a replica of it for study, but also then to feed that information into the database so that we can look for patterns in colors and numbers and space and structure, etc. So that's much of what we do with the Quipu databases.
So this might be a little bit hard. Can you put a number on how much have you broken the code of this? Is it you've broken 25%, 50%, 75% of the code? Another tough question.
Right. Well, the question is how much is actually there, and what is actually there? And we think that, for instance, that if we have a chord, for instance, that has the numerical value 75, then the question is 75 what? Is that 75 days, 75 yamas, 75 what? So how were they indicating the identities of the materials that were being enumerated in the Quipus? We think that was by a combination of elements like color and structure, and I've only just touched the tip of the iceberg of the complexity of the structure of these. In terms of the construction of the chords, there's variation of spinning right or spinning left in terms of how pendant strings are tied on. They're tied on one way or another way. The way the knots are made, the knots are varied. So there's a tremendous amount of structural variation in the Quipus, and we've got all that in the database, and we're trying to understand how that may have provided some of the information, the coding, that would be read by the Quipu keepers. And they would read off, this is 75 yamas, is not 75 days.
I see,
right?
I see, yeah.
But we think that they were not writing, like the normal definition of a true writing system is one that reflects the elements of a language. So it's tied to a language. And so the signs that are written, like our alphabetic signs, for instance, they are strung together to reproduce the sounds of words in our language. They're strung together differently to represent the sounds in other languages.
Yeah,
so we don't think
interesting.
that's what they were doing with the Khipus.
I
We don't think they were about language. We think they were collections of signs that had conventionalized meanings. And if you were a Khipu keeper, you had to go to school to learn the conventionalized meanings.
Yes,
right.
yes.
They had a 4-year school in
Really?
in Cusco, in the capital, and the Khipu keepers, the ones who served the Incas at the highest level, had to go to this school, and 2 years of the 4 years was learning the conventions of the Khipu.
What's next? What are you going to be working on next to ascertain what these things are telling us?
Well, the research is going in different directions, but I would have to say that in terms of my own work on the Khipus, I'm increasingly interested in trying to understand how we can interpret and understand the information in the Khipus to help us try to begin to write histories of the Inca Empire. So, as I mentioned earlier, this was not a system of writing. So when the Spaniards came, they couldn't just decipher it and then read it. It was a system that was based on conventionalized signs, and we're trying to understand, we're trying to figure out, we're trying to decipher that system. But in the meantime, we do have a tremendous amount of information on numerical data that had to do with administration in the empire. Administration is one component of what has to be accounted for in writing the history of a people. And so these data, whether they're about censuses or they're tribute, or whether it's about resources and storehouses, this was the world of the Inca. So we're trying to draw on that to allow us to sort of sketch out an outline of the Inca world from the Inca's point of view.
And you have done so much to evolve our understanding. I have a book here from a museum in northern Peru, in the Chachapoyas area, that cites you as the expert on the Khipus. You have done so much to evolve our understanding, and just want to thank you for it. And it's such a wonderful region of the world. People are so nice there, and if the people reflect how the Incas were, then the Incas probably were very nice too.
I agree.
So we're talking with Professor Gary Urton. His book is Inca History in Knots, and this is about the Khipus, reading Khipus as primary sources. This is New England Authors. We're recorded here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and broadcast on stations across New England. Watch locally. If you need to get in touch with us, contact your local station or on the Curiosity Foundation website. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.